And welcome to V-Road, CCTCG's weekly Vanguard Podcast. I'm Cole.
I'm Trey.
And this week we've got our very special piece of our rotating co-hosts. We've got...
Hi, I'm Jared. I remember I got into Vanguard because of Cole. Back in 2019, it was set 6, and he handed me a Dark Irregulars deck. I played a little bit, and I liked all the little moving pieces. I split a box with him that day, and then I played for a little bit, and then just life happened, couldn't get out to play. And then a couple years later, at the start of Overdress, Cole messages me out of nowhere. We had not talked for a while, and says, "Hey, you want to play some Vanguard?" I'm like, you know what? Sure. Went down to his apartment at the time, handed me Hex Orb Sorceress. We played for like 2 hours, and I was hooked with the new standard of Vanguard at the time.
Yeah, I remember back in set 1 of standard, me and somebody's got a case. And I think on a complete whim, I can't remember what it was. It had to be like extra Eugenes or something. Or like as much of the deck as I had after what was left over from our case, and I just traded for all the Hex Orb stuff. So you know what, it might be a good opportunity to help my friend get into it, because you said you had like a weird, not fascination, but you always seemed inclined towards like the Protect decks, from what
I don't know if it's like that I have a fascination with them, or that they just perfectly printed the things I like on cards in nations that were already Protect.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, seems about right. And Protect, I mean, was free PG. It was a super, well, and Protect ones at least were free PG. Super simple, and I mean, played towards your style of play, playing those long games, playing very methodical strategy games. So it makes sense.
Yeah, and that leading into today's topic, which is a bit of a review of how we feel about the design of DivineZ so far, in that, you know, back then Protect decks had those free PGs, and that was like a defensive mechanic built into those decks, and that did a lot towards like how they were designed. So many of them ended up having these grade 3 finishers that they'd have to like soul blast some grade 3s and get crits and guard restricts and all that. And going along with how many guard restricts were in standard, we lead, or in V, we lead into standard where there are just like none. Up until, I want to say, had to be DivineZ, because I swear my eyes bugged out of my head when I read Chris Rain's grade 1, and it had the wackiest little guard restrict I've ever seen. And it got me thinking about like how far standard has gotten to the point to where we're getting stuff like that again. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, it's one of those ones that kind of can sneak up on you. It requires 3 cards to guard or a sentinel. The fact that it has the text "or" is an interesting one, because we have obviously must require 2 cards from hand, and that makes sense. You throw a sentinel down, you discard for the sentinel, and you throw something else down as kind of fodder. But the fact that it's one or the other, to me, just adds a fun, funky twist to it. I agree. Very odd card.
Yeah, I do like that they're giving you ways to kind of play around it by putting the "or" on there. Holding the sentinel for their impressive Vanguard swing has just always been the play. And I do like that they still let that counterplay be in there, but punishes them for not playing around it.
Yeah, exactly. It makes me think about how between this deck and, I swear, I could be wrong, but the last time I saw anything close to like a meaningful guard restrict is on Flagberg of all cards.
I was gonna mention that Flagberg, when you're talking about old cards with guard restricts, I was like, him? 3 card after 6 attacks, if I remember?
5. It had to be 5.
I believe
it was
it was 5.
Yeah.
Even then.
Yeah, just funny.
It just reminds me of how little guard restricts are really in standard. But then you know, as we get to divines, we have like, you know, a Brand Gate grade 1 that if you persona ride or whatever, like on place counter +1, it lets the thing in front of it when it boosts have a guard restrict, and it's just kind of refreshing to see that again. I think if they only leaned into it a little bit more, maybe decks like it's cool that Isyana is getting a restanding Vanguard. That deck screams to me that it wants like a cool guard restrict, though. Am I wrong?
Yeah, as someone who actually plays that deck, I don't like it just becoming another flavor of 5 attacks, the Vanguard, or 4 attacks when you only have one of the rear guards. And that deck doesn't really want to have a rear guard that isn't like punishing my opponent for like taking game actions, either guard restricting or bouncing their things. It does not feel like it meshes well with the rest of the shell of the deck.
Yeah, I agree with some points and disagree with some points about the whole guard restrict. I don't think we need it too much more. I think it's sprinkled in here or there, adds for some, again, kind of interesting like counterplay to your opponent. Like you force them to think about your deck more, kind of like in our conversation last week, where there are some decks that you can just kind of turn your brain off against and just play your deck as is. Having that guard restrict does throw that in there. But agreed, Siana's one of those decks where, yes, when you get attacked as Siana, you can do certain things, but it struggles in its own attacking phase just a little bit. So having some sort of miscellaneous guard restrict in there, I think, could be a big help.
Yeah, it's something I want to see put into decks like maybe Gryandra, you know, decks that they're what they do is very consistent and they can reach their ceiling rather easily, but their ceiling just isn't enough by itself, and they need that last little push of needing 2 cards or more. I can only faintly remember back in V when all of those like no Sentinel guard restricts would just destroy a Protect player. Especially when like a lot of Protect decks had those grade 3s that had a Sentinel restrict on them. But you really just don't see that in Standard anymore. And I think if those are applied to decks like really carefully, I don't see any problem with them.
I think V got away with it a little bit more than Standard is able to because of the Protect markers. I mean, when you run into decks that, you know, have the potential of having like up to like 10 potential Sentinels between 4 in deck and then Protect markers, whereas in Standard up to this point until set 2 coming out, we really only had 4 perfect guards per deck, and even then you had to find them. There was the occasional like Kyoka now can cycle perfect guards from drop and things like that. You know, very seldomly is there more than 4. So having that true Sentinel restrict can be kind of tough. There are decks that do have it. Luard's Second Stride, where you have to discard a Luard for it, has it. Cat Girl, blanking on her name right now. She has it. Warnoral, thank you. Has the guard restrict of Sentinel denying. Like,
I completely forgot that too. Was that on her original one, or did they put that on the new one?
It's on both, actually.
Oh, it's on both. Okay.
Yeah, the festival form has it plus drive +1.
Gotcha. So they really did
drive +1.
Her and Flagberg were kind of the leaders of early Standard guard restrict. But yeah. I do kind of want to zero in on what you said earlier about how it feels like decks these days are designed in a way to where you don't like get to just play your own deck and ignore what your opponent's doing. You do have to be very conscious of how their deck plays, what tempo it's at, how it wants to do what it wants to do. And I think a really good example of that is like Reziel, because when you're playing against that deck, you know that what they call is completely dependent on how much damage they have. and what they've dumped into their drop zone, what they've intercepted with, how many crits they've seen. All of these factors, I don't think is even that hard to incorporate into your gameplay, almost irregardless of what deck you play. And I remember that our attitude has slowly changed over time from how aggressive and big their turn 2 was, into being like, okay, this is just a function of the deck, and now it's easier to play around it with that in mind.
Raziel to me is an interesting one because yes, you have to call 2 different cards because of his skill. So yes, keeping their damage kind of low forces them to either call a singular column worth of cards or force them to call a grade 1 to the front row to have an attack. So yes, playing around Raziel's skill there until you know you have some sort of kill turn. I mean, obviously you can kind of get away with it by just beating him if you are able to keep up with hand, and you can really fight against 5 attacks per turn. There are certain decks that can kind of get away with that. Varga is obviously one of those because you're retiring, so you're forcing them to rebuild board. Things like that. If they're running the dog and Teeth Felt package, obviously they have a lot of card draw as well. Free kind of board build per turn. So it's just learning that balance of keeping up with their skill specifically, but also, trying to focus on what your deck does. It's an interesting balance. I don't find myself forcing myself to play around the counter on Raziel as much, and just kind of focusing more on what Mai does. It's a little tough when they always have that 6th damage miracle here with any trigger. So filtering their deck is tough, but if you can get to them early enough, kind of force them to play uncomfortably, you kind of have a good advantage against them, I think.
Yeah, keeping them at 4 damage is usually what I see messes with me when I play the deck, because being at 5 lets me call like a grade 2 and a grade 3 to the front row, and that's when you get your best 5 attacks and all that. But going back to that Divine skill, it is another shift I see in Divines where, not necessarily from Divine skills themselves, but this shift towards defensively oriented decks. Off the top of my head, like Lascaria and Android and stuff, and a bigger emphasis in using parts of the game that we've explored a little bit, but then expanding on them quite a bit with Blitz Order.
Yeah, I really like the design that they've been going for with modern Blitz Orders, because back in the day, the best Blitz Order was something like Ghost Chase or like Call to the Beast, where the max potential it hits is 15k. That is the best it gets. Why would I not just try to find another trigger off of that instead? But nowadays we're getting orders that can actually beat out that power level, like the Brantgate Blitz Order that calls 2 things from drop. That can get you way above that 15k threshold to be better than a trigger. Lascaria's Effervescent Blade, that's also just 20k right there. They've been designing a lot more Blitz Orders to actually beat that 15k shield threshold to be more than just a worse trigger.
Yes,
yeah.
And I almost wonder if it is a direct response to how explosive the set 13 meta was, how quick Youthberg and Virena could be in pushing you really early before you even got to grade 3. So, especially because, I believe that Blitz Order that Lascaria has is a grade 2, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so you can really, it might not be opportune to use it early, but the option is definitely better to have than not.
Yeah, and it feels like they did a pretty good job. It didn't feel too forced with them saying, oh, hey, we're going to throw in all these Blitz Orders because we realized set 13 was pretty quick and there was a lot of things like that. They've been pretty good about keeping the Blitz Orders at that grade 2 to specifically kind of combat that for a long time. Obviously, they're much better now in the instance in Lascaria and things like that. Obviously, Evergreen Transfers are one of those ones that is a grade 3, but, Regalis piece once a game, essentially. It it makes sense that Evergreen is that because it's 25,000 shield and has the red tech skill that's just fantastic. But for your typical just additional shield, yes, I think it's very nice to have some better ones. It felt like it was a design aspect that they had intended to go towards for a while. Maybe it got sped up by set 13, but I felt like it was going that way, especially with the introduction of Lascaria, being able to play multiple. Obviously, we kind of had that with Lascaria and Lutetia that have been kind of heavier Blitz Order decks, but it, introduces the ability to run Blitz Orders in decks that typically you wouldn't see run Blitz Orders. Ava being one of those. It never really needed it, but its new Blitz Order that allows you to call 2 from drop of grade 2 or greater from different card names allows you to just call both Obskies. There's a 30k shield. Like, there's not much better than that. And it feels like an interesting tech piece that people can throw in for faster metas.
Yeah, and what helps me go with your thing, like, they didn't just push Blitz Orders super hard because of set 13 or whatever. They made a really good one that if you just happen to draw a lot of, or in this deck's case, just find them. You can just tutor for them. Then you could play like quite a few in one turn. But it's the fact that it's Energy Blast 2, right?
Correct.
Yeah, the fact that it's just energy, not even a lot. All these older Stoicheia decks that can just throw this in because maybe they didn't catch up on the 50 main deck update, and they need something to not get blown out by decks these days, so they just throw it in there, and they're not even using a resource that the deck already does. That's in that the energy, I think, is one of the better things that have come out of Standard.
Yeah, like, my only problem with energy right now is that we don't have enough cards that use it, in that you have a bunch of decks that just can't fit in an energy package, so you're just leaving free resource on the table, and there's just decks that are so filled with too many pieces that they need that it doesn't feel like they can even throw in, like, the generic cyclers without, risking to just not find their pieces, not go off, and then just look at their opponent with no pressure.
Yeah, I think we're slowly seeing that now, especially with set 2. We're getting decks like Gryandra that I mentioned way earlier that happen to have, like, because it can't use energy cyclers, it can still have like a grade 2 that it's like on place Energy Blast 3 draw card. Like stuff like that. Small things like that that we're at least getting in some capacity. I wonder how much Bushiroad will push energy into older decks like they have with Alukia in set 3. That deck, I think, is going to be a lot more conscious of its energy with that. And it just, every time I see them take an old deck and put energy into it somehow, even decks that came out a set before, like Rezile getting its new grade 2, you actually have a very tight amount of energy you're using, and it's fun to manage that resource, because I don't know how the rest of you guys felt, but when I first saw energy and how freely you're able to get it and how much your opponent can't really interact with how much you get, having a deficit of that resource feels more impactful for every energy you spend.
I thought energy was... I didn't think it was a necessary mechanic that we need in the game. I was concerned that it would cause some technical issues to the game, that they were trying to make the game a little easier for new beginners to like join the game. I thought it was going to make it more complicated for that, because now instead of having 2 resources really with your soul and damage, it added a third one that's just more to manage. I think it still kind of has a nice balance to it. In reality, I think it actually has been implemented pretty well. There aren't too many cards that really use that resource, so on decks that just say, hey, I think I could use one more card, that Energy Blast 7 helps out a lot of decks. Whereas in decks that, like Lascaria, that uses it as its like almost main resource, it does have a good balance, and I think it has that playability with just about everything. Obviously having the new cyclers that are good in just almost every deck. Even for just the guard effect to be able to draw more cards, or even use their actual persona skills. There's a lot of great implementations to the energy, and I've been greatly impressed with it. It was a little frustrating to learn and get it into the muscle memory of everything, but now it's just I think a fantastic resource that I'm glad we have.
Yeah, I feel like any problem I really have with energy right now is literally just going to be solved with time. As more cards get introduced to the format, and more times we flip up that energy charger at the beginning of the game.
Yeah, it is a muscle memory. I think all of us, even now, we don't have it completely down, but it says a lot when any of us play any deck that doesn't really care about its energy at all beyond the Energy Blast 7 to draw a card, versus people who really liked Welstra. And now it has a when it attacks Energy Blast 2 operated thing. And now it's okay, now I have to engage with this. I can't forget about it. Or if I do, I'll get reminded at least by the time I get to grade 3.
Yeah. And especially with its primary new operation target, and obviously if your opponent has the correct amount of damage and everything, it still even has hey, when this is placed, energy charge and draw is it does force you to remember it, because even your grade 2 uses it into good effect. That is one deck I think so far that has done a very good balance of making sure that energy is used as a fairly common resource in it. Obviously it's still very counterblast heavy with its cards and soul heavy as well, but the being able to introduce all three of those resources as resources for both the ride line and its supporting cards I think are fantastic.
And I think that can go cleanly into the other design space they're finally getting to, because I don't really think they've touched once per game mechanics since the Zeroth Dragons, where if you strode them, you gotta kill them that turn or else your G-Zone's gone for the rest of the game. So it really did feel like they were trying to emulate something that we have now. And, there's a spectrum to it. Welstra's just getting some orders, playing an extra one. I think he does it. He gets to just play an extra one, right? Is that right? He just puts one in?
Just it takes 2 from hand, puts them into the order zone.
Gotcha.
Pretty
but
easy.
then you have there's the setup ones that don't do much beyond that, and then that can carry over to Reziel, where it's half setup, half pressure. It's very contextual to stuff like this walking nightmare of a card that is Blangmire. I don't think he's poorly designed. I do think there is a little bit of an antagonistic push to this deck. It wanted to completely counter Reziel in every shape and form, and it does. They did it, but they had to put a lot of text on this card to do that.
So much text.
Yeah,
it's been a learning nightmare. I would say really a nightmare. It's been a good reading, because you definitely will have to read every card multiple times.
Yep.
I think I've played maybe 6 games with it so far, and I still can't tell you every card ability. I have to read them every time. But it's adding these in the once a game abilities. I just, maybe I'm pessimistic, I guess, but was very anxious about them getting at it. I thought, okay, these are going to be so broken, which so far between 2 sets, they've not gone too far. I do like that there are, again, kind of those 3 main, or maybe even 4 main aspects of them. They have setup like Welstra, and half setup / great ability in Reziel. You do have your offensive ones like Varga, which obviously, essentially just allows a 3rd Vanguard attack, 4 drive checks. Just can't go wrong there. Not a lot of decks can do that. And then Bragmire, which is pretty much just that counter aspect of it. I think it's going to create some interesting pathways for them to add new divine skills down the line, but we'll see how those come.
Yeah, as we get towards the destined ones, I guess we'll see how well this opinion ages. But at least for now, we are getting ones like Varga that, while it is very strong, we have over time, it definitely feels like that deck that, out the gate, it felt like it was impossible to play around, and like this ability is such a blowout, and you can like auto kill your opponent with it. But now, over time, it's becoming more and more easier to make sure this deck doesn't get to do it at once until you're like truly ready for it. And I think that says a lot about how well these are designed to me.
I definitely, early on, when we heard once per game skills, I was in the same camp of, oh god, we're just going to see these win the game on the spot. And when we saw Welstra's, I was like, breath of relief. It was, I think, my favorite of them, because I just like the fact that it is a really, really efficient setup piece. It means your deck's almost always going to do what it does, but it doesn't do it in a way that punishes your opponent and have them play around it. And even like, I like Raziel's skill, just because it does what you would expect a normal Vanguard deck to do. Drive +1 is not the scariest thing in the world. Like, yes, the shuffle back in crits is definitely a big, powerful part of that, but it's not a guaranteed, oh, I'm going to get more damage, I'm going to push my opponent even further. Versus, like, versus Varga, I do really like that they at least had the decency to put a restriction on that one, of giving you a little bit of play, because if they didn't, I think that would have been problematic. I still think it's one of my least favorite ones. I have yet to play against Chris Rain and Blangdmeyer, though, so I do not have an opinion yet. But I don't see Blangdmeyer being a fun experience.
Building on your point of Varga, I think the fact that it is leaning more towards like the only deck so far that has like a truly offensive skill. Chris Rain can also kind of get there with, duplicating power and criticals. So you can kind of also put it in that same field, but again, that's kind of what that deck is solely focused around. Once that one is done, that divine skill, it kind of just floats around and plays like a lower tier deck in my opinion. But Varga is one of those ones, yes, once you go into that divine skill, it feels like a game ender, which is kind of like the only real deck that we have that does that. Youthberg is kind of that way when you go into full blast, like, hey, I'm going to do everything I can to try to kill you this turn. But, PG it's not the end of the world. But 3 attacks from a Vanguard that keeps its triggers and things kind of sucks. Luckily, doing as well as Bushy did with its balancing, giving it to Dragon Empire, where we don't have any countercharging, it makes sense. Like, it's a tough resource. I mean, the ideal turn for Varga is 3 counterblast. If you have Shura's and you're using CB to restand from the first skill and the divine skill to CB restand, it's it forces your opponent to focus on the amount of damage they take, but also if you just kind of delay it, you can only force them to go one way, either restand twice or call Shura back, and both ways, it is super player roundable. So I think it's in a very good spot and feels still gross. Don't get me wrong. It feels horrible when you're like, oh, I can guard 4 attacks this turn or 5 attacks, and then there's that mystery 6th and 2 additional drive checks, and
I think what that gets us to is something that I think this format was missing for like a really long time, which I remember way early in Standard. If you played against like Orphist or Bastion, those decks had like Counterblast 2 skills on them, and if you damage deny them and you know what those decks do, you literally do gimp their whole turn, or at least you severely diminish it. Like, damage denying was a legitimate strategy, and it just hasn't been for so long. when we went into like Orphis Regis, wasn't a factor anymore. When decks just started using like other resources besides just Counterblast, or started using things like Youth Perk, where it didn't matter what you really did to them, they just needed one Counterblast, and sometimes 0, and they could still do like a Gust, or does he take a Counterblast? I don't remember. But there are still plenty of there are plenty of decks now that don't even use Counterblast like at all, like Gryandra and Lascaria, for its restand, but not for the main thing it wants to do, which is getting its power and its crit.
Blackmire doesn't.
Doesn't? Oh my god, you can't even damage that guy.
Nope. I mean,
it's still on a spectrum.
He has one card, a grade 2, that does on plays Counterblast, Soul Charge, and draw a card. And then he has one that is his 5th attack enabler, where it is Counterblast, restand a 4th attack enabler. Sorry. Restands a rear guard for a Counterblast. But again, it's not its main grade 3 needing the Counterblast. Whereas Rotovisor is a Counterblast too. And that feels gross, let me tell you. It feels like it should have maybe been a set 4 deck, and now it's in Divine set 2.
I just appreciate that it's at least on a spectrum now. Like, if you damage a Deny Varga, it really genuinely means something. If you damage a Deny Rezile, if you keep them at 4 damage, and more importantly, if you keep them at 4 face down damage, because then they always have to discard for their booster that lets them countercharge. So they'll still get to do their thing, but it's still you're lowering their ceiling by being conscious of how much damage your opponent has. And I think that's a part of this game that has always been more relevant in like Premium, for example, but kind of it packed up its bags and it just left standard for like a year and a half, it feels. And it's just another mark for the design team that we're getting stuff like that back. All this being said, the design team isn't perfect. There are always ways that they can take what we're seeing right now and finally, push it over the edge. Near the end of whatever happens in season 2, set 5, they sneak in with that new Liel. They give us a new Rezile, like a Mahar Nirvana, if you will. Even if it's not a grade 4, they do something that's like, all right, this one has a better divine skill, or like, you can only do this divine skill if you've done a divine skill this turn already, and you can just do it again. I can imagine there's so many ways that they can take what they've done now and go off with it. So what do we think is maybe a couple things that they could avoid as far as the design space they're exploring?
Well, I think one is one that you just said.
Yeah.
You can't divine skill this skill if you haven't divine skill this other skill. I think that is something that shouldn't be a thing in the game coming up. It's a potential, and I wouldn't put it past Bushy to enable that. But it already feels, and it was a thing that divine skills are specifically a once per turn. Once you use it, it's done. Regalis piece, you use it once, it's done. That those are things that are something that shouldn't be done again. I don't think it's already good to the point, like certain skills, and then maybe they make them not divine skills. Maybe it's something else, a lighter skill of it, but it's like a semi divine skill, or maybe a 2-parter. Like maybe they could add it where it is on your attacking, you do this, which, Rezile's kind of already that way, but defending it does this type of thing. Like you can activate it in one of 2 phases. That would be an interesting mechanic where if you're attacking, you can get this and you get this text, or for your defense, you get this text, but it's still the same skill block. You get your 1 divines, but it doesn't need 2 divines, I don't think.
I think that kind of reminded me about how they're sort of giving lighter divine skills to non-faded decks already. With Dayusha, he's got to remove the Goyusha from his soul or something like that, and you can only really do that once. But I think I feel like I remember seeing people try to run extra Goyushas in the main board. Just try to like put it in Soul, but I don't know how that would work if it's... I think it says you have to already have one not in the bind zone for it to work. I don't know. People are weird. They'll try to cook up anything. But at least it's interesting to see them explore that outside of Faded 1. And then that makes me wonder how these Destined are gonna be.
Yeah, I just hope that with like going forward with these once per game skills, they don't either make them super overpowered and not restricted, like if Varga didn't have his forward damage restriction, or the other way where like I would hope that your once per game skill doesn't just make it so the rest of your Vanguard doesn't have lines of text on it, because it's not fun to just boost out your divine skill, they survive, and then you're playing lyrical generics Chris Rain, like.
Yeah, I don't know. It's the spectrum of, oh, now that you've done the divine skill, you really just don't have much of a Vanguard. I do agree with the point, though, that I really hope that if they're going this route, we're getting once per games. Can we please not try to get once per games that are explicitly trying to one-up and, like, out-power creep out other once per games? I think Blankmire should be a flash in the pan. I hope that there's not necessarily anything wrong with a divine skill that can be made to counter maybe a specific deck, or like a certain type of play that, well, these have for the most part been pretty easy to play around. They can easily be designed in a way to where, oh, if you're playing around it too much, then you'll get punished for it. However they could word that. But, yeah.
I do have kind of an interesting idea that I don't necessarily want them to see, but I would be interested in how they would implement it. Would be an EB10 divine skill, like where to activate it you have to do those like EB10,
okay.
Like adding in some sort of like like turn skip, or if they added in like a turn skips, like essentially. Chronojet used to have it back in G, where it would literally, you would do your turn and then your opponent wouldn't get a turn. Like that would be something interesting because well, first off, it already puts you in a bad sense with the energy blast, so puts you out there, and it's a once per turn, so you can only do it once. It obviously could create some interesting things. I don't think that is necessary to the game, but I would be interested to see kind of what Bushy's mind would think in something along those lines.
I think maybe a Destined one maybe of time could do something like
I mean,
I sure hope we do not
Oh
get
my God.
extra turns in the format. They are death sentences, basically, in any instance.
I'd be fine. Okay, hear me out. I'd be fine with it. I would be fine with a turn skip if it was a 3 attack deck and that's all it did was 3
Okay,
attacks.
that would have to be the design space of 6 attacks max.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when you look at it, that's all it is,
2
is 6
turns.
attacks. Yeah.
Which I would be fine with. Like, I mean,
Okay.
that's nothing different than like Lael attacking 6 times here.
True.
Or
Yeah. Okay.
Maelstrom attacking 6 times, or Flagberg, or any multi-attack deck attacking 6 times. The only difference is it is essentially a restanding Vanguard. You get to reset, you do energy charge maybe again, so you get a little bit of resource advantage. But obviously it would become a heavy cost. So even if it was that EB10, then maybe you recuperate the EB3 back on that time skip or turn skip. But it feels like it probably won't do enough, to really set it back. But again, it would have to be a 3 attack deck. Like there would be no real valid option to say, okay, this one actually gets 4 attacks and makes it 8 attack across 2 turns. That would be unreasonable.
You know
I
what,
just
Trey?
don't
I
trust.
think you predicted what the new Aliel is gonna do when you said, oh, Aliel's divine skill, it just lets it do 6 attacks. I think that had to be like a precursor, a hint. I think that's what we're getting.
I'm sorry. We typically refer to Jared as Jared Bushy Road because his dad works at Bushy Road. He plays the main character deck, so that's a running joke in our group here. But I think I may be an insider at Bushy. Who knows? We'll see.
Don't worry, the Destined one is already calling my name, so I'll be main character again after this season.
There we go.
Oh, the Stoichia guy?
Yeah.
Nah, he's an antagonist.
Main antagonist.
Yeah, I guess he'd be your first antagonist deck, huh? But
True.
I mean, I don't know. I didn't read Cross Epic.
He was
Eos a bad guy.
good point. You know what?
Touche. Actually,
Actually,
he was following the light of the path of light, following the main characters, and now he's going back to the dark side. I think following the destined ones to the dark side.
But to digress back to that 3-attack deck, I don't trust Bushi to design a 3-attack deck nowadays.
yeah, that's fair.
Fiona was the perfect setup for a 3-attack deck that could work, as it is incredibly defensive and puts enough pressure on your opponent that they either need to commit more resources to actually deal with it, or they just have to take your Vanguard who is 3 drive checks and a crit, which is not comfortable. But then they messed it up. They just said restaining rearguard. Or let's look at Zorga, another deck that worked actually genuinely fantastic as a 3-attack deck. Mask gave it an extra attack, Divine Skill gives it another attack. Why does it need Prison? Another deck. It was pressuring you with 6 damage and big numbers, and locked out resources to make you play this little resource game. Another time they gave it another attack.
Yeah, oh man, yeah, I remember one morning I was at work and I was listening to the different fight stream where he was translating the Lascaria cards as we saw them. And I feel like it had to be the last card or second to last card, but I was hearing him say the effects of all these cards. I'm like, okay, this deck seems really interesting. It's it's exploring something that maybe only a 3-attack deck could do, where it's trying to get a really bulky hand and outgrind the opponent, kind of what Orphis did in set 1, and then it said restander, there you go, CB1, stand it. I felt my spirit leave my body when I heard that. I don't, it's coming back to, I'm glad we have guard restricts now again. I'm glad they're printing them. Well, what I meant when I said we need more of them is they need to be adequate enough in decks designed now and whatever they support later to let that be its gimmick. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
I think Lascaria would have been a way more interesting deck as a design if they gave her, if you have 3 Valanos, get the 5k power, and made it just more power than 5k per one, but then made it a 3-attack deck and then replaced the restander with a guy who just says on attack, counterblast, gets 5k with the Velano thing, and then 2 cards to guard him. I think that would have been a way more interesting deck than a different flavor of 5 attacks and my Vanguard's mechanic.
Yep. I have to go on a little bit of sidebar just because thinking about Varga and Lascaria here. I have to say I'm so glad that they've brought back in the random grade 3 boosters. It makes me so happy as a player just to say, you know what, here's kind of a goofy number. I'm not going to attack with the grade 3. I'm actually going to boost a grade 2 that has a decent skill and give it just that extra little bit of power. You can give an underwhelming card just that great amount of power. And I, it's tough to say underpower or bad grade 2s or whatever, but being able to just boost a random card with a 13k, I don't know, something tickles my fancy about it, and it's just fun.
I do love and appreciate looking your opponent dead in the eye and saying 26. I don't know why, that's one of my favorite things, getting these random grade 1s that, if they're grade 1s that get 5k themselves, or just a grade 3 who can do a boost.
Yeah, at least for now, we can give the design team a lot of props. At least I think so. I think they're putting the game in a direction I feel it hasn't seen maybe ever, or at least in a pretty long time. and I hope that, you know, they give us more things to talk about for a decent bit. But that being said, I think we'll wrap it up here. If you listen to the end, thank you. It means a lot, especially for up-and-comers. But you know, you can find our individual Twitters under us. And if you like this video, then like it. If you can see listening to this kind of stuff become regular for you, then maybe subscribe. That being said, I was Cole.
I'm Trey.
And I'm Jared.
And see you later.